Hi, I'm Eva Spencer. Today, we're going to talk about phytoplankton. Now, don't go away. Just because I used a funny word doesn't mean that you won't find this interesting, because I find the possibility of using phytoplankton to save the world pretty interesting. Now, did you know that there are these things in the ocean, little almost microscopic plants that absorb CO2 and that do other things for us, which I don't fully understand. In fact, I hardly understand at all, but I've got two guys here who know a thing or two about it. And we're going to have a conversation about it, and they don't know each other yet, but they're going to get acquainted. And you will too. Ricardo Letelier is a professor at the University of Oregon. And I looked at his CV online, and I tell you, I hardly could read a word of it. It's got all kinds of fluorescent things and all kinds of words in there that baffled me. But the heart of the matter is that he's a specialist in phytoplankton, I believe. And I guess you're in Oregon now, are you not, Ricardo? Is that where you're?
I'm in Oregon, and I'm sorry, I will correct you, but I'm at Oregon State University, not University of Oregon. Just to make it clear. So
there's a little bit of rivalry there.
No, we get along very well. We have rivalry, but just to make it clear, I'm at Oregon State.
Well, you see, normally I write these things down in advance, but I didn't this time. I was winging it, and
that's perfectly fine. Everybody makes that mistake. So there's nothing new.
Okay, and I know Peter Fikowski a little better, but I'll probably flub up his credentials too. Peter is in California. He's in Silicon Valley, as a matter of fact, and he belongs there because he seems to know all these people who do strange and wonderful things. And he is a big-time activist in the climate change movement. And I won't tell all your secrets. I don't know many of them, but there you have some good ones. So, Peter,
well, I think that I would like to talk about the climate restoration movement. So, what we're interested in, and Ricardo, I'm looking forward to Ricardo's thoughts. Is what we're really interested in is giving our children a safe climate, not just studying the change, but giving them the safe climate.
Absolutely. Well, but you see, you avoid using the word geoengineering, and I use it all the time because I have the notion that we have to rehabilitate that word, that it's become a dirty word, and it shouldn't be, because there are a lot of things there we need to learn from and to use. And I don't take any particular position on this at the moment, but by the end of this hour, our viewers will have an opinion, I betcha. So I'm going to ask Ricardo, if you will, to begin by telling me and the world what you know about phytoplankton that we should know also if we are going to be interested in the implications of using these little guys to help us control and manage the global climate.
I would start by saying that phytoplankton fundamentally are the ones that engineering the world as we know it today. People a lot of times forget that the first big pollution event at a global scale took place, I would say, 2.5 billion years ago with the oxygenation of the atmosphere. And that oxygenation took place really because suddenly you had these small microorganisms that we call cyanobacteria that were able to use the light from the sun and split the water, to use the water as electron donors. And by splitting the water, they were able to not only fix carbon, use that energy to fix carbon, but also to produce the oxygen that we breathe today. So to a large extent, phytoplankton are the ones that are responsible for the atmosphere and the chemistry of the atmosphere that we have these days. So we had, like I said, we had a big pollution event 2.5 billion years ago.
You call that pollution? When the phytoplankton started producing oxygen, that's pollution?
Yeah, because barely until that point, basically our Earth was completely anoxic. Barely bacteria that live at that point were only in anoxic environments. There was no oxygen.
I thank you, but I'm glad they did it, don't you?
Yes, but that's the question when we talk about saving our planet. We are saving it from where? So that's the big question that I ask. Usually we save it like you was saying, what like Peter was saying, we are trying to save it for the next generations, but we are saving it really from an anthropocentric perspective. And I would go even further to say that it's not necessarily from an anthropocentric perspective, but it's also from a social justice perspective, because you and I and most of us that are looking at this, we will have the means to deal with the changing in climate that we are seeing. But a lot of people will not have those means, and those are the people that usually end up paying the price. Phytoplankton, like I said, Betty, they do photosynthesis like the plants and that we see on land. Roughly, they do 50% of the photosynthesis that we have in the planet. Betty, around 50% is done by terrestrial plants, and the other 50% is done by the plants in the ocean. The big difference that there is between the plants in land and the plants in the ocean is that in the ocean, there is a very, very strong coupling between the microbes that do photosynthesis and the other microbes and the small organisms that eat them. So in the land, and when Peter shows the plots from NOAA that have those large oscillations, annual oscillations of CO2, is because plants usually absorb in spring. They will absorb a lot of CO2 because they are growing very fast, and there is an uncoupling between the photosynthesis and the respiration. That is the one that will produce the CO2 back into the atmosphere. That's why you have a seesaw pattern.
Okay, but I think we're jumping ahead of what I think you're referring to. My guess is that Peter sent you a picture of the graph showing the effect of Mount Pinatubo. Is that what happened? Because I know you guys had a chance to get
Shall I put it on the screen?
Yeah, please do. And it's interesting because it's a zigzaggy kind of thing. But I don't want to deflect.
Here's the zigzaggy.
So that zigzag shows basically the seasonal patterns of the uncoupling that takes in mainly in the land between photosynthesis in the spring when plants are blooming and growing, and respiration that takes place in the autumn when plants go dormant. Mm-hmm. In the ocean, and the point that I want to make is in the ocean, there is a very, very strong coupling between photosynthesis and respiration. So most of the photosynthesis that take place in a day in the ocean is respired in the same day. So there is a very, very fast cycle because microorganisms have a...
You got to help me. No.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not following. This respiring thing, I understand breathing. What is when a phytoplankton respires, what is it doing?
Well, it does the same thing that we do. Billy, we do photosynthesis. Well, it breathes, Billy. It burns carbon. It burns the organic carbon, the same thing that we do, and uses oxygen to produce water and CO2. So you always, what biology does, fundamentally, what biology does is it takes light and elements from nature and packages them in the form of organic matter. That's what photosynthesis does. And then we eat the plants, we eat those things, and we respire them. But the all organisms respire them, and by respiring that, basically we release those nutrients, and we release that organic matter in the form of CO2, and we produce water. We take the oxygen. That's what we respire. We do oxygen. So we larger organisms like cows or trees, etc., we tend to uncouple it in space and time, the photosynthesis from the respiration, the production of organic matter from the respiration of that organic matter. In the ocean, that coupling is very, very close together. So a very, very low amount, and that's one of my critiques that we will go later on in some of Peter's analysis.
They're tiny, tiny things, aren't they?
They're very, very tiny.
Can I see them with the naked eye?
Just the largest ones, the very largest one, you can see them with the naked eye. Darwin has a beautiful description when in the Voyage of the Beagle, when he comes out of Brazil, that he see the sea dust in the surface of the ocean, that there are nitrogen fixers. And those ones, you can see them by the naked eye, and they form a kind of sea dust rose in the ocean. But most part of them, you will never see them, and some of them are less than 1 micron, so they are smaller than the size of your hair. You can see respiration as the opposite reaction, or the opposite process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis takes CO2 and puts it in organic matter and produces oxygen, and respiration takes that organic matter, breaks it apart, and produces CO2 and takes up oxygen. So those two things are if you are able to uncouple them in space or in time, then you do what we have done now, that we have produced oxygen into the atmosphere and we sequester carbon. Is that what you want to do when you do iron fertilization? What you want to do is to have photosynthesis that take place in the surface of the ocean, and the particles will sink down. That's what we call the biological pump, will sink down, and they will be respired at depth. So you have uncoupled the photosynthesis that take place in the surface of the ocean from the respiration that will take place deep in the water column.
Okay, so the name of the game, if we want to save the world, is get lots and lots of phytoplankton, more than we're used to, because they're going to handle the matter for us. Now, is that a little bit oversimplified? Tell me, is that what Peter is all about?
Well, I would say it's a little oversimplified, because as Ricardo said at the very beginning, the phytoplankton, the carbon they produce gets rather quickly converted back into CO2 and water. And I'm looking forward to having a technical conversation with Ricardo later about the details of that. So I had not looked at that, but it's becoming very clear. So it's critical to manage the dynamics so that a lot of the carbon that's produced gets sunk where it won't get metabolized, where plants and where animals won't use it for energy.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so
now
it takes both, produce it and get rid of it.
There are people who have a plan to do something they think is going to really be very useful. What that involves is, I understand that there are large areas of the ocean where there's not enough phytoplankton. And the phytoplankton is desirable for a lot of reasons. One being that it produces, it is food for fish. And if you have a lot of phytoplankton, you have a lot of fish. So if there are places in the ocean that are like deserts, where there's not enough phytoplankton and not enough sea life, then you could presumably make up for that by providing the nutrients that the phytoplankton need. Now, as I understand it, if you go around sprinkling little filings of iron into the ocean, and not very much of it, that's what they are short of, and you can get a lot more phytoplankton to be blooming, and you could get a lot more fish, and you could also, if depending on the scenario that we hear Ricardo describing later, you could also sequester theoretically more of the CO2 from the air. And there's a guy who tried to do that. In fact, he did do it. His name is Russ George, and I had invited him to be on this conversation with us, but he hasn't shown up. He might in the middle of the show, I don't know. But thing is that a few years ago, as I understand it, he made a deal with the Haida Indians in British Columbia. They wanted to improve their fisheries, the stock of salmon. And so he went out in the water, in their waters, and sprinkled iron. And sure enough, it made a lot more phytoplankton. And sure enough, the next year they had a lot more fish. But the Canadian government said, stop it. We don't like you tampering with nature. So he hasn't been allowed to do it ever since. I've given a very brief summary of what I think, what I've heard, but I may be off, and somebody can correct me. Peter, please tell me what the more accurate description that I've tried to summarize should be described as.
This is the description of what?
Well, how far off have I been in my quick overview?
Oh, I think you're doing very well. And the way I describe the situation is, as I said at the very beginning, that why do we want to study the climate and why do we want to learn more about it is so that well, the knowledge is nice, of course, but as parents and grandparents, we want to make sure our children and grandchildren have a really decent, a really great planet to live on. And we evolved at CO2 levels and climate that we had for 10,000 years. And intuitively, that's going to be the safest place for us to go back to. Now, nature never stands still. And so when we go back, the planet will have changed. But we want to make sure that we don't end this scene in humanity with curtains and everyone goes home and it's time for the cockroaches. We want to end the scene so then there's the next scene after it and we can evolve gradually.
Okay,
And
let's invite Ricardo then to correct my summary of what I think happened.
I think that first of all, I would say that it's not only the Canadian government, because from the United Nations we have a moratorium in that type of experiments. So that is
What's the matter? Because I haven't heard that anything bad happened as a result. So why would anybody object to what he did? It sounds like we should encourage that.
well, this is one of the things that has divided tremendously our community. I would say, because the fact that we don't know what has happened at small scale doesn't mean that we know what will happen when we bring it to a much larger scale. Basically, the ecosystems don't respond linearly to the size of the perturbation.
Well, scale it up gradually. I mean, if you're going to do something risky, you stick your toe in the water first, and then you might put your whole foot in. But
I'm sorry. Yes, you're completely right. But that's what we have said as scientists, and for a long time. Let me go back to the origin of this idea. And these are the origin of this idea of iron fertilization comes from Martin. John Martin, an outstanding scientist, and John Martin really did a lot of good work, but at some point he realized that there were regions of the ocean where there were plenty of what we call macronutrients that are nitrogen and phosphorus, and still we have very little oxygen. And those regions really are the subarctic Pacific, the Southern Ocean, and the upwelling regions of the equator. That's what we call, we call HNLC regions, high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions. There are other places of the earth
say it again. High nutrient, low what?
Low chlorophyll, low phytoplankton. Although you have high nutrients, you have low phytoplankton.
Why?
We talk because that's what John Martin suggested, that there was a lack of iron in those regions. Okay. So I will make the distinction. One of the distinctions that I will make is not every single region in the ocean that has low amounts of phytoplankton is iron limited. There are other regions of the ocean that are limited by phosphorus, like the North Atlantic, or are limited by the place that I study, that is the North Pacific, that oscillates between iron limitation and phosphorus limitation. So not every region of the ocean, if you put iron, they will bloom and you will have high phytoplankton because other nutrients will become limiting very, very rapidly. So John Martin, what he said, and that was very controversial, he said, "Give me half a tanker of iron, and I will create another little ice age." That was his that's what he said at some point, and everybody's remembered by that. I think that John Martin, one of the great things that he did was allow the scientific community to do experiments in a different way that we used to do until that point. And it was the idea that we could fertilize some small regions of the ocean to try to understand how the ecosystem, not only the phytoplankton, but the full ecosystem will respond to these perturbations. And I think that that's the step that is a lot of times missing in the kind of work that Ross George has proposed to do. Let me put it, from a scientific perspective, I'm all in favor of these experiments. But it's very different to say, I want to make these experiments with the goal of sequestering carbon and to see how much carbon I can sequester, to asking the question of, I will make these experiments to try to understand how the ecosystem responds. And by understanding how the ecosystem responds, I can constrain the uncertainties about carbon sequestration in different regions of the ocean. That to me is a valid reason as a scientist of how to do these experiments. My goal is to understand the ecosystem dynamics, and that will inform other people how to do the right way, the sequestration of carbon, if it comes to be. But starting by saying, I will dump iron because I want to increase fish productivity or I want to sequester carbon, to me, that is putting the cart before the horse. And I think it's fundamental for us to make that distinction. And the community we have groups in our community now. For example, in Woods Hole, there is an initiative by Dennis McGillicuddy and others to try to readdress the issues of these experiments and try to understand how the ecosystem responds to these perturbations, so that we can be informed of what different scales nature and Peter has shown this with Monte Pinatubo. Nature shows us the different scales at which this perturbation takes place and can take place. Mm-hmm. But we have to and so we know that these perturbations take place in nature. I don't know that we have done a lot of work in trying to quantify them over time. So it is more anecdotal than anything else. But we have different scales. The question is, what are the scales at which these kind of perturbations, not only in space but also in time, they are safe to do. Mm-hmm. Now
I think what you're trying to identify would be the conditions under which it would be okay to do certain kinds of experiments, and the conditions under which it would not be acceptable. I think both of you agree on something about the motivation. To me, I when I thought, would I have done that? Yeah, I would have probably gone along with that. Why not? See if I can increase the fish for these people. I don't see anything wrong with that. What I see personally wrong, that my criterion, I think, has something to do with whether it would be likely to be possible to reverse what I tried to do. In other words, there's certain experiments that, for example, spraying sulfur into the stratosphere. Well, now that once that's up there, you can't get it down. So you can't reverse that once you've done that. I think I'm very nervous about that. But, if it's something like...
Meta, I believe that's just simply incorrect, by the way. That once the aerosols are there, they last a year to 2 years, and they always come down. But that's a topic for a different
Yeah,
place.
but compare it to what I think Stephen Salter used to say about marine cloud brightening, which was that, okay, if you created a flood someplace as a result of your marine cloud brightening experiment, you just turn off your spray gun, and within a week, the whole thing has stopped. You're back to normal.
That's right. That's right.
That seems to me acceptable because, you know, there's a risk maybe, but at any rate, you can reverse it.
Yeah, but it's important. I think you were saying the same thing, that whether it's a week or whether it's a year or 2 weeks or 2 years, it's negotiable. And that's the important thing, is to actually have something that you can negotiate with.
Yeah, all right. Ricardo, now I interrupted you. Sorry.
Several iron fertilization experiments have taken place in different regions of the world. Betty, last time I counted, there were at least 11 that took place, and
really,
yeah, 11 took place, yeah, by scientists all over in the North Atlantic, in the North Pacific, in the equatorial Pacific, in the Southern Ocean. Actually, Phil Boyd has a very good in Marine Ecology Progress series, has a very good summary of all these experiments and the outcome of these experiments. And one of the fundamental problems that we have had with these experiments is that, like I was saying before, in order for that carbon that is taken by phytoplankton to be sequestered over long periods of time, it has to sink deep into the water column. If it respired in what we call the upper, I would say, 200, 300 meters of the water column, where most of the carbon is respired by the fact, and that water column is mixed at a seasonal scale. During winter, it gets mixed. All that CO2 that was produced by respiration will be degassed into the atmosphere. So it has to go.
I don't get it, because I thought you said what they're respiring, what they're exhaling is oxygen.
Well, yes, but basically when the particles start sinking down, they are being respired by the bacteria. So that organic matter is the same thing that you're doing right now yourself. You ate something and you're respiring and you're producing CO2 with every breath of air that you take. You take oxygen and you burn the calories. So those particles are doing the same thing. They are sinking down in the water column. And as they sink down in the water column, they are being respired. So they are producing all that CO2 that was converted into organic carbon is being respired as it sinks down and it's converted
by bacteria, not
by bacteria, by the phytoplankton itself, because phytoplankton are doing this two things. They are doing more photosynthesis than respiration, but once they get into the darkness, that respiration doesn't stop. It keeps going. The photosynthesis stops, but the respiration keeps going. And the bacteria also that are munching on them are respiring. So
when they don't have photosynthesis, what they're respiring is CO2, not oxygen. But when I see. Okay. So when they fall, they change from respiring, from exhaling oxygen into exhaling CO2.
Yeah. Usually what happens is that they are always, all the time, constantly, they are respiring. But what happens is that they are doing more photosynthesis than respiration. So they are producing more oxygen than the oxygen that they are consuming. But once during the day they do that, but at night when there is no light, they keep respiring. So they are producing CO2 during night because they are not doing photosynthesis. So, and when they go deep in the water column, there is no light, they will keep respiring. So most of the CO2 that is being taken up by phytoplankton during photosynthesis ultimately is respired, and a very small fraction of all that CO2 makes it very deep in the water column. So if it's respired in the water column, in a region of the water column that at a seasonal scale gets what we call ventilated, that it gets mixed back to the surface, all that CO2 that has been accumulated at depth will be released into the atmosphere.
Mhm.
And that's one of the great uncertainties that we have even today with all these experiments, is to try to figure out how much of the CO2 that has been taken out by the phytoplankton really is making it deep in the water column. And usually at 150 meters, that is a normal place to look at it, although I'm concerned about taking us an homogeneous layer. But at 150 meters depth, usually you get less than 10% of the organic matter that has been produced in the surface waters to make it through to 150 meters depth. And when you're at 500 meters depth, is in the order of 1%.
That's news, isn't it? Yeah, that's bad news. Now, set me clear about another thing, and that is, I run across very frequently the notion of stratification in the ocean. That the ocean is becoming more stratified. That is, the top layers are not mixing with the lower layers as much as they used to, and that is a problem. Now, it sounds as if you would want it to be stratified in order to accomplish get the you don't want it to mix, because if you bring it back up, you bring up all of the CO2 that had sunk, and therefore it would all get back into the atmosphere again. So you would rather have it stratified. Set me straight on what's so about that.
No, you don't want it to have it stratified, and I will tell you why. Because if you stratify the water column, what happens is, again, photosynthesis takes place in the surface, okay? And if you have net photosynthesis, what happens when you have more oxygen being produced? What you're doing is you're not only removing the CO2, but you're also removing all the nutrients that are in the surface. So you need to have nutrients coming back to the surface. So when that organic matter that you made during photosynthesis with all these nutrients and this CO2 became organic matter, sinks deep in the water column, then, and they are respired, they release all those nutrients back into the environment. So if you were to look at to a very stratified water column in the surface of the ocean, where you have light, you have depleted all the nutrients, because you have had much more photosynthesis and respiration. So you have taken up all the nutrients. And those nutrients basically are all those nitrogen and phosphorus and even iron and all other trace elements have been moved down into the water column, where they have been respired, and that produces back those nutrients. So you want to bring those nutrients back to the surface to allow that carbon. But when you bring back those nutrients to the surface, you also bring back that CO2 that was released by respiration. So the trick is, and that's what happens with a lot of these phytoplankton, is that when particles start sinking down in the water column, not all nutrients are released at the same rate when you respire. So when we look at what we call the reluminization curves of carbon versus nitrogen with phosphorus, usually what we see is that phosphorus is released first, then more rapidly than nitrogen and carbon, and that nitrogen is released a little bit faster than carbon itself. And then there is some carbon, a very small fraction of carbon, that is what we call a recalcitrant carbon, that makes it all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. So to a large extent, what you want to do is to make it in such a way that the organic matter that you produce, when it's being respired deep in the water column, will release these nutrients faster than the carbon itself. And the carbon will make it to the bottom of the ocean. But you want those nutrients to come back to the surface. And for those nutrients to come back to the surface, you need to be able to mix that water. That nutrient-rich water that is just below the euphoric zone needs to come back to the surface, because if not, you don't have nutrients for the phytoplankton to grow. It's kind of having a plant in a pot, a pot, and the plant grows, but if you don't fertilize it, it will stop growing at some point and will start dying.
Mhm.
So that's why you have to be careful that a very stratified ocean will become what we call a desert.
I have something else I'd like to pursue, but I think I should let Peter, I should be
Yeah.
quiet. Peter, go for it, whatever is on your mind.
Well, what's interesting to me, of course, is our pathway to restoring the climate for our children.
Mhm.
And when this came on before you started recording, Ricardo was illuminating that domain. I think for the audience we might have,
Mhm.
that is probably a question that's dear to their heart. Is first of all, is it the right thing to do? I think everyone agrees it's the right thing to do to restore the climate if we can. And then the next question is, well, is it possible to restore CO2 levels that humans have flourished in? And history shows us that our planet has gone through ice ages many times, and that and cooled a lot, removed actually the same amount of CO2 that we need to remove, which is around 1,000 gigatons.
Mhm.
And so we have history on our side. We know it's possible. And then the question then becomes, well, can we do it? Can we do what nature did? And of course, Ricardo's research is illuminating that answer.
But he hasn't got me solved, though. To me, he's raised more problems than he's eliminated.
Well, I can see both sides of it. So
Let's ask him. You mentioned that these iron fertilization experiments have been done all over the world. I didn't know about those. I only knew about Russ George's. So tell me what they have found out from these experiments. Is there a simple one answer solution to all of them?
No,
No.
no, there is not. But what we have found is that different experiments done in different regions at different times of the year generate very different results. And the most, and now NASA had a very large experiment, not of iron fertilization experiments, but a very large experiment over the last few years that is called Export, to try to come down to that question, to try to constrain how much of the phytoplankton that is produced in the surface of the ocean really makes it to great depth. And that's one of the initial questions that John Martin, that we talk about, had. Really, he had this large experiment that was called Vertex, that was really to try to see how particles that sink out of the euphoric zone, that is the zone where we have photosynthesis, how those particles that sink down in the water column get remineralized, how they are moving deeper and deeper in the water column. So that is still, I think that one of the largest uncertainties that we have in this process of iron fertilization is to understand how much of that organic matter that is produced really makes it to depth and is not respired before it gets sequestered deep in the water, where it can stay for 1,000 years. And I would say that what you want to do with this kind of experiments is something that a Canadian, actually, basically Turpin and a group of Canadians, was several papers by Turpin and Harrison, did in the early 80s. And what they did was to look at how phytoplankton would respond, not only to the amount of nutrients that you give them, but the way in which you give them those nutrients. It's very different. They did very outstanding experiments looking at what we call chemostats. And the chemostats is you try to grow phytoplankton in cultures, and you give them a constant per unit day. You give them a constant amount of nutrients. And what they did with these experiments, to me, that was fascinating, was to give them the same amount of nutrients every single day. But in one case, they gave them that amount of nutrients in one single pulse in the day. Just it was a single time in the day they will give them 100 units, and then the another treatment was to give them, rather than give them 100 units at a single point, they would use them 10 units 10 times during the day, and then they would give them 1 unit 100 times during the day. So what they did was just to give them exactly the same amount of nutrients over a 24-hour period, but the way in which they deliver the nutrients were different, the frequency. And what they saw is that depending on the frequency, it would be the type of phytoplankton that would dominate in their cultures. They had mixed cultures. So understanding not only how much nutrients we will give them, but how we deliver those nutrients, and how we are able to produce what I was saying before, that uncoupling between photosynthesis and respiration is fundamental. If you give them very slow the nutrients, what you do is that the assemblage will adjust so that the respiration would balance the photosynthesis. If you give them pulses, very short pulses, but very strong pulses, usually you have one group that will start growing very, very fast, and the rest of the community will not be able to catch up with it. So
Are there good phytoplankton and bad ones? Are there some that we like and some we don't like?
I hate to say that, because I think that all phytoplankton have a role to play in nature. We have phytoplankton that we are very concerned because we call harmful algal bloom. There are some phytoplankton that are toxic. They produce, for example, domoic acid, and domoic acid can produce neural damage. So yes, there are some phytoplankton that are toxic and can be harmful for mainly for mammals in the ocean. I don't think that is my primary concern, because many these kind of blooms have taken place, and nature has been able to take care of them. But it's something to keep in mind. If you do experiments, and that's what we have seen, where what takes off are very, very small phytoplankton, what we call the Synechococcus and Procorococcus, those ones will not sink down up to the euphoric zone. But they will stay there. They will not. They will need to be eaten by something else before they sink out of the euphoric zone. And because they are eaten, they will be respire much faster. So usually what you want is to have phytoplankton that are heavy and they are large, that they will sink very fast in the water column. And those are usually diatoms. Diatoms forms these shells that are made of silica, and those shells are very heavy. So once they are not able to control buoyancy, they sink like rocks to the bottom of the ocean. So optimally, what you would want to have is some of those phytoplankton that would grow in these blooms. But that's one of the things that we don't understand well. When we do these iron fertilizations, most part of the times we don't understand what will end up growing in them. And that has to do with probably that we don't understand very well the dynamics of the delivery of the nutrients, and how that delivery of the nutrients will generate one type of bloom than the other one. So I go back to my initial point as a scientist. Why I'm interested is that when I make a perturbation, how the ecosystem will respond to that perturbation, to that type of perturbation. And if I make a different type of perturbation, what will happen with the system? And if I understand that, then I can start constraining the uncertainties of what Peter wants to do, is to use those kind of experiments to restore climate. That I don't like that way of saying about restoration of climate myself. And I'm sorry, Peter, but I think that really I understand what we want to do, but I have a strong bias to the idea that we end up spending even more energy to try to compensate for the energy that we have used up to now.
Mm.
Rather than to say how we can minimize the amount of energy that we put into the system to control the environment, what we are saying is let's put more energy in order to control the environment that we want. So that's my concern with the idea of climate restoration. We are just spinning up the wheel in terms of energy, the usage of energy, even more and more.
Right, right. Yeah, Ricardo, that's a common concern, that the efforts to restore the climate will make things worse because it requires more energy to remove the CO2 than and thereby produce more CO2 than you actually removed. And
Well, that's what life cycle analyses do, isn't it? To figure out whether or not, in any one case, it's worth the effort to do what you.
yeah. Well, the interesting part for me is going beyond what we know, because there are a lot of things that we don't yet know. You know, maybe an infinity of things we don't yet know. And so then the question is, how do we discover the critical things that we don't yet know that will yield us what we want? And so, as Ricardo said, and Meta, as you said, that we know that life cycle analysis will guide us to neutrality. It's unlikely to take us to anything much beyond making things not much worse than they are now. But yeah, net zero is what the press talks about. And it sounds very good, but the truth is, if we achieve net zero by 2050, as everyone talks about, then it'll be a very miserable life for our descendants. And that's not good. I don't think anyone wants that. And so then the question becomes, if we were to have restored the climate, clearly we would have done it in some way that doesn't require a lot of energy. And there's good evidence, again, from the geological record that nature doesn't know how to do it. Nature does it. Nature does remove vast amounts of CO2. And then the question is, how can we learn to replicate that in a way that serves our purposes?
Mm-hmm.
And
I think you need to explain. You showed this Mount Pinatubo effect.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about what it did, and I think you need to tell people why that had that effect, what you think was going on.
Right. Okay. Well, let me put the slide back up.
And then I want to know whether or not Ricardo agrees with you.
Right. So the graph here shows CO2 levels since 1958 up into the present. And they go up and down as the plants in the northern hemisphere grow and then recover in the winter. Then we zoom in following the Mount Pinatubo, and you can see right here a flat place. And then this is zoomed up, so this is 1989 through 1995. And we call this the Pinatubo pause because the steadily rising CO2 paused for a year and then resumed steadily rising. And at the moment, I've produced some rancor in the field discussing this, which is unfortunate, but that's often how change happens, is a period of rancor. And the main point is that this happened. That we
But what happened when
Right.
the Pinatubo blew out? It emitted some nutrients that fell in the ocean and stimulated the phytoplankton so that they absorbed more of the CO2 than they otherwise would. Is that the explanation?
Yeah, that's a theory. I happen to like that theory, but as a physicist, I'm not an ocean scientist, so my physicist opinion doesn't count for very much. So, but what's interesting is what happened is the increase here. This is simply the rate at which we've been burning fossil fuels. So this is 20 gigatons per year back in 1990. And then actually, there's a little dip, but I don't think that's here, where in the beginning of 91, the Soviet Union collapsed. And so it was a slight 1% or 2% decrease in the overall emissions. You wouldn't see that. That's too small to see. But then again, something happened. And we think that it involved removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Whoops. Oh my God. What did I do? Yeah, it'll come back in a second.
Okay.
We'll use this one. This is good
Yeah.
enough. And so CO2 was going up. It was stable and going up again. And so the theory is that that something removed the 20 gigatons of CO2 so that the curve dropped down 20 gigatons. And then the question one could ask, well, what caused that? As a physicist, one of the popular theories is that the ocean cooled because when Mount Pinatubo blew up, it launched about 8 million tons of sulfate into the stratosphere, out into the outer atmosphere. And those of us of a certain age remember that time in 92 when the sky was notably grayer. Here in California, where we have our blue skies, they were sort of gray skies. They're more reminiscent of where I grew up in Washington, D.C. And but that's separate. So separate from the cooling, there was also the huge amounts of dust matter that you mentioned blew into the ocean. And so we have two effects. At the moment, the ocean community is promoting the idea that because there was dust in the stratosphere, which cooled the planet by about up to a half a degree. It was an average of about a third of a degree. That third of a degree of cooling allowed the ocean to just absorb more CO2. It's much like
I'm sorry, but now this was like aerosols in the air that kind of filtered out the sunlight.
yeah.
The amount of sunlight falling on the ocean was slightly less. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I have a nice graph here. I apologize for taking a moment to find it. Right, it's coming up. It's coming up. Here it is. So this is CO2 again, and this is temperature, and this is the scale is now 1850 to 2100, and so the historical part. So from here's today. Historically, you can see after Mount Pinatubo, you can see the temperature dropping by a third of a degree, and here in the CO2, you can see it leveled off for a year. And this is another volcano in 1980 in Mexico, and I think there was one in 63 in Bali. So when you have a large volcano, you get a temporary cooling for typically a year and a half, because the dust in the stratosphere reflects sunlight and it cools the planet. And again, typically by a third of a degree, maybe a quarter of a degree.
That's wonderful. Can we figure out a way to create more volcanoes?
Well, let's not go there, please, Meta. But what we can do is the amount, you mentioned earlier, and I called you on the mistake that when you do put the aerosols in the upper stratosphere over and over again, we see it lasts a year and a half, year to 2 years. And it's only 8 million tons that was done in 1992. It can probably be done much more efficiently because, again, nature didn't have any engineers to figure out how to do it efficiently. So we could actually put the aerosols up there and produce that same cooling. And that's another topic for another conversation.
It is. And in fact, we've kind of, so far as I can tell, we've gone away from the theory that it was phytoplankton that explains.
No. Well, no. I'm going there because, as I said, I right now I'm dealing with the controversy I fired up in the ocean community. So there's the cooling, and if you calculate, if you have a cold soda, and as it warms up, you can see the bubbles coming out because as things warm up, as liquids warm up, they hold less CO2. And that's true of the ocean. So as the ocean cooled down a third of a degree, it also absorbed more CO2. So hotter, less CO2, colder, the CO2 goes into the water. And so that's been the main theory. Unfortunately, when you multiply out the amount of water there is in the ocean or in the upper 200 meters, that it comes out to about 1,000th of the actual effect that we saw in the CO2. That the amount of CO2 that the ocean can absorb when it cools down by a third of a degree is about 1/1000th of what was really observed. And so how that gets resolved, we shall see. But in my experience, what that leaves is, again, as a physicist, I believe in conservation of energy and conservation of mass. And so the CO2 had to go somewhere. And if it's not in the outer ocean, then maybe it got sucked down into the deep ocean in a downwelling eddy. Because it turned out that there's a downwelling eddy right where the ash was flung from the Pinatubo, and it's not been observed at that magnitude. Has never been observed at other times. We have only had a few decades to observe these things in. But in my paper, I note that the Bali eruption in 1963 was fairly similar, was maybe half or 2/3 the magnitude of Mount Pinatubo. And there seemed to be a flattening of the CO2 curve as well. But interestingly, that CO2 all went back into the atmosphere. As Ricardo said, the biocarbon gets digested by various things, and it all went back into the air. Whereas following Mount Pinatubo, that wasn't the case. And so
this has been an excursion away from the phytoplankton, unfortunately.
Oh, this is the phytoplankton. This is the phytoplankton. Yeah. So and so the question is, you have to grow the phytoplankton, and everyone, pretty much, Lester, Ricardo might argue, I don't think so. Pretty much everyone who's ever tried adding iron to the ocean where there's no phytoplankton finds that they get phytoplankton growing. I'm sure there's an exception, but everyone accepts that you can grow more phytoplankton. The critical part is, how do you get the phytoplankton to the deep ocean where the carbon will stay for 1,000 years? And that's the issue. It's not that the phytoplankton everyone agrees on. It's the how do you get it back down there? And that's where the excitement is.
Well, that's
so
I'm excited too. But let's see, because we're
let me say one last sentence, because we are getting towards the hour here. So the key thing that I've been arguing for is we should work hard to replicate that unique thing that happened in 1992, because if there's we would like to get the CO2 back to safe levels, and at the moment there's only one. That's the only possible pathway that would get us there before things collapse too far. Now, we don't know how long it'll take for things to collapse, but the ecosystems are collapsing, the permafrost is
Hold on,
collapsing.
you said I shouldn't go there because I was saying, yeah, let's find out how to make more volcanoes, but you didn't want me to ask that. Cardo.
I'm not frustrated. I really like to hear different perspectives. So really, that's what keeps me honest down the line. I would tend to question Peter's unique interpretation in the sense that I think that both things are taking place. It's not one or the other. Really, one. We have sequestration of CO2 from the atmosphere. It takes in the ocean. There are two main ways in which that carbon is sequestered. One is the biological, what we call the biological pump. And the other one is that the one that Peter mentioned, that is the sublimity pump. That is basically, if the ocean becomes, for example, cooler, it will absorb more CO2, more oxygen, and also there will be a stronger mixing, and the formation of deep water in the high latitudes that will move toward the centers will be enhanced. So you end up having an enhancement not only of the CO2 that is trapped in the first 200 meters of the water column, but all that water mass that is being subducted from the high latitudes that are colder into the middle of the ocean, and that also contributes. So making the being able to quantify or at least qualify how much of that CO2 that decreased during Pinatubo was the result of biological activity, phytoplankton that we are talking, and how much was the result of pure physics. And I would highly recommend Peter to look at a paper by Fay in Global Geochemical Cycles, where they really looked last year, I think it was January of 2023, where they used Earth system model to really try to look at the quantification of how much of the CO2 had been taken by the effect of Mount Pinatubo, just simply by the physics themselves, by just replicating in a model. And I have to say, it is our system model, but it was not 1,000, but it was more like 1/4. But it didn't account for the full amount, but it accounted for a significant fraction. So understanding, and again, being able to constrain those uncertainties is what we scientists are called to do.
What's wonderful is the complementarity between the science and the engineering. That the engineering uses the science, and the science uses the engineering, and these kind of interactions are very useful. Because Ricardo, I actually had not looked at the polar subduction, and so I'll look into that. I think it's important, as you pointed out, that would account for maybe 1/3 of the amount. That's important. I don't know, and we, as Meta said, we might want to put some aerosols in the stratosphere, duplicate that aspect, which is not expensive. It's estimated to be a couple $2 billion a year if we wanted to do that. Of course, similarly, depositing iron and possibly phosphorus in that same area where the dust fell. If it worked once, we probably can make it work again, but that's an engineering issue.
I think we've got more work to do before we're through with this issue. Yeah. This has been great fun. Thank you very much. I've learned a lot, not nearly as much as I need to learn, but it sure is fun to do. Appreciate it. Okay.
Meta, thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I learned too. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Meta.
Project Save the World produces these forums. This is episode 592. Watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues, and we welcome your comments too. To find a particular talk show, check the scroll list on the homepage or use the search bar. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free of charge newsletter to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We gladly email the magazine as a PDF or link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. Please type "subscribe my group" as the subject of your email. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.